The widow came into sundown with blood in her mouth and a rusted ring on her finger. No wagon, no kin, just a threadbare shawl wrapped around bones and memory. Her name was Ruth, though few asked it. Fewer still used it. They called her the drifter's bride, or that witch from Carrion Ridge. They said she had bad luck in her blood, that her husband was a rail worker who slit his own throat with a soup spoon rather than spend another night beside her. That was untrue. He died in a storm 3 winters past, lungs full of creek water, and the body never surfaced. Ruth waited 3 days in a sodden cabin with a tin lamp and a boiled squirrel. Then she buried what clothes he'd left behind and walked toward the next stretch of living. Sundown was not built for the meek. Its main street ran between 2 ridges like a scar, and its people clung to cruelty the way others might clutch scripture. The widow stepped into that dust-throttled town just after the church bell cracked in half and the barkeep's dog was found hanged from the water tower. Superstition festered fast there. They said Ruth brought curses. They said her silence was unnatural, that she stared too long, prayed too little, and smiled not at all. That first week a boy kicked slop water at her skirt. The next, a grocer shorted her change and slapped her when she noticed. By the third, someone had smeared dung across the chapel pew she tried to sit on. The preacher said nothing. Nobody did. She took to living behind the old blacksmith's shop, in a lean-to half rotted by wind. Nights were cold, days worse. When work could be found, it was shucking potatoes at Harlan's kitchen, skinning squirrels for the trapper, boy, or scrubbing the parlor where the girls wore rouge and never aged. Each job ended in bruises or slurs or a long walk home with her jaw clenched shut so the tears wouldn't fall. The beatings didn't begin with fists. They began with eyes, the kind that weighed her like meat in a larder. Then came shoves, a bottle hurled at her spine. Finally, fists and boots, always in public, always with a kind of glee that turned the air sour. She didn't fight back, not at first. She curled inward, silent as a nailed coffin. It was at the cattle auction in late spring when the rancher saw it. He was leaned on the railing, black hat low, chewing licorice with his thumb hooked lazy over his belt. His name was Silas Rourke. Folks called him the Black Ram, not for his stock but for his temper. Richest man in 3 counties, owned 200 head and most of the East Ridge. Widowed himself, they said, though no one ever spoke the wife's name. He'd seen Ruth before, watching her from the feed store porch or atop his roan when he passed through. But that day he watched a man, Greeley, the butcher's cousin, slam her into the dirt for stepping too close to his cart. She didn't scream, just blinked slow, mouth bleeding, hair tangled with hay. Rourke didn't move fast. He didn't raise his voice. He stepped down from the rail and walked through the crowd, past the jeering boys and spitting girls, until he stood between her and Greeley. He looked at the man, then at the blood on Ruth's chin. "You done?" he asked. Greeley puffed like a rooster. "She ain't your concern, mister." Rourke spat licorice. Then he drew back and punched Greeley in the neck so hard the man dropped without sound. The silence that followed sucked the heat from the day. Rourke didn't speak again. He looked down at Ruth, held out a calloused hand. "She didn't take it." So he crouched beside her and said low, "Ain't charity, ain't pity. I need a wife and I'm tired of looking. Say yes, and you'll never be struck again." She stared at him, blood dripped down her neck. Behind her the town waited, laughed, sneered. Ruth nodded once. They were wed the next evening under a sky the color of ashes. No guests, no preacher. Just a paper signed by the sheriff's assistant and a ring slipped onto her finger by hands that shook almost imperceptibly. She moved into the Rourke ranch that night. A long ride, wind cutting sharp across the hills. When they reached the house, a 2-story beast of timber and stone, she stepped inside and did not weep. Not even when she saw the locked bedroom door at the end of the hall or the cold stew left on the stove. Silas didn't touch her, not that night, not for weeks. He didn't speak much either. He worked the land from dawn to dusk and came home with sweat in his collar and mud on his boots, but he didn't hit her, didn't spit or sneer. When she coughed, he brought her water. When her hands blistered from churning the butter, he brought gloves from town. Still, she didn't trust him, not yet. Trust in her world was a thing you paid for in blood. But at least now she could sleep without waking to footsteps behind the wall. And that, for Ruth, was more than any vow could ever promise. The wind on the Rurk land carried a different kind of silence, one not sharpened by cruelty, but by space. Miles of dry grass and black cattle, fences that stretched into nothing, a barn with rust-colored doors and a loft full of old newspapers. Ruth spent her mornings with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, scalding the floors clean with lye, scrubbing her presence into the grain of the house until her arms trembled. It was the only thing she could control. That and her voice, which she still used sparingly. Silas left before the sun climbed. He'd saddle up, nod once, and ride out. He never asked her to cook, never asked for a kiss or kindness or anything soft. He simply gave her space and the shelter of his name. In town, that name turned eyes away. The beating stopped, the laughter curdled. Men who once spat at her boots now looked past her like she was smoke. The ones who didn't, young brutes or drunk fools, were quietly made to vanish from the street for a while. Some evenings, Silas sat on the porch and whittled. He'd hand her a tin cup of sweetened whiskey, and they'd sit like that, unmoving, until the stars came out. The quiet stretched between them but didn't threaten to snap. Weeks passed. Ruth began to learn the house. Its creaks, its smells, the way light pooled on the floorboards near the kitchen window come morning. She discovered a small room behind the pantry with a broken rocking chair and a ledger full of cattle brands dating back to the war. She found a tin box under a loose floorboard filled with hairpins and a child's glove. She did not ask. Silas did not offer. Once she caught him standing over a grave near the orchard. The stone was worn blank by rain. He didn't notice her at first. When he did, he only said she hated lilacs, said they stank like corpses. Then he turned and went inside. Ruth did not ask who the grave belonged to. But that night she dreamed of a girl with ink on her fingers and hollow eyes. She dreamed of lilacs rotting on a pillow. By midsummer, Ruth had taken to riding the land with Silas. At first he offered to keep her back, said the country was rough, the land vast. She didn't answer, just mounted the mule without waiting for permission. He didn't stop her again. She rode at his side, watched him mend fences, birth a calf, bury a dog that went bad from snake bite. She didn't cry when it died. He did, though only once he thought she wasn't looking. They began to speak in fragments. "Too dry this year," he'd say. She nod, "Crops won't last." Later, she asked him to teach her how to shoot. He hesitated, then brought out the Winchester from the cellar, placed it in her arms like a sleeping child, and said, "It'll knock you off your feet the first time. That's how you know it works." He was right. She fell back in the dust, stunned, laughed once, sharp and startled. He didn't laugh, just helped her up and loaded another round. By the time the leaves yellowed, she could shoot a squirrel from 50 yards and gut it with her eyes closed. He never praised her. She never asked him to. One night, a rider came to the ranch. Silas was out. Ruth answered the door with the rifle in hand. The man wore a crooked hat and smelled of whiskey and sweat. His teeth were brown, his voice oiled with false charm. Didn't know the black ram had found himself a new ewe. She said nothing. He tried to step inside. She raised the rifle. He stopped. "Tell your husband I came looking," the man said, eyes flicking down her dress. "He owes for the last run, and I don't like being owed." He turned and rode off without another word. That night, Ruth told Silas what the man had said. Silas leaned back in his chair, fingers laced, face unreadable. "He's not wrong," he said finally. "I owed him once, I don't anymore." She wanted to ask more, didn't. But she started watching the hills for riders. Winter came hard that year. A blizzard swallowed the west fence and killed 7 head. The ranch hands quit. One left a note, the other left nothing. Ruth and Silas worked through the storms with scarves tied over their mouths and lanterns hung from their belts. They slaughtered what cows they couldn't feed and buried them in a pit near the orchard. Ruth's hands cracked from the cold. Silas stitched them while she slept. He began sleeping in the same bed, though not touching her, just two bodies beneath a quilt. One time in the dark she said, "Do you miss her?" He answered, "Yes." She said nothing more, but she understood something then, that he was not whole and never would be, that he didn't need a new love, just a quiet place to set down his grief. So was she. In January, the preacher's boy rode out to the ranch on a frost-bitten pony. He carried a letter. A man in town had said Ruth was a witch, had taken to carving her name on the chapel doors, said the Lord would not suffer a heathen's hands on holy land, said a bloodletting was the only cure. The preacher had done nothing to stop him. Silas read the letter once, then tossed it into the stove. The next morning, he rode into sundown with Ruth behind him. When they arrived, the street emptied like a wound. He walked into the chapel and spat on the pulpit. "This town lays a hand on her again," he said. "I'll put it down like a rabid dog. You remember me, preacher, I don't bluff." Then he turned and left. They never called her a witch again. But that night, someone nailed a dead rabbit to their door. Ruth pulled it down without a word. Inside, she cleaned the blood off the wood with a bucket of hot water. Then she loaded the rifle, placed it by the bed. And when she lay beside Silas, she turned to face him for the first time. He did not move away. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was waiting. Spring crawled back slow and mud-thick. Snow melted into the bones of the land, and the creek rose until it swallowed the cattle path near the orchard. Ruth took to wearing trousers when she rode, her skirts torn beyond mending. Silas said nothing about it, just handed her his old pair of boots and tightened the stirrups. They worked together now without words, like hands on the same rope. She repaired fence posts while he branded calves. She learned the names of the far pastures, the way storms moved across the canyon like a herd of ghosts. He taught her to track broken hooves, how to spot a wolf before it circled close. She taught herself how to make preserves from the fruit that wouldn't last, how to stretch coffee with roasted chicory when the sacks ran low. What they didn't have, they didn't need. One evening, while she was salting the last of the meat, she found a strip of linen buried deep in the cellar larder. It was blood-stained, stiff with age. A child's, maybe a woman's, the memory of the grave flickered. She held the cloth up to the lamplight, then folded it small and buried it in the fire. Later, Silas walked in with blood on his jaw, a gash across his knuckles. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. But that night, she reached for his hand beneath the quilt, held it until morning. By midsummer, the land began to breathe again. Green broke through the gray. Calves were born clean. The creek turned sweet. Ruth planted beans near the edge of the yard and watched them stretch for the sun with a hunger she understood. But peace never stayed long on land as dry as theirs. It began with a fire. Midnight, a blaze lit the eastern ridge like a signal. Silas woke first. He ran toward it while Ruth threw water on the barn door to keep the embers from catching. By dawn, the flames were out, 3 fences gone, 4 heifers charred to the bone. On a stone near the creek, someone had carved the word whore with a dull blade. Silas came back with soot in his mouth, hands shaking. He didn't speak, but he sharpened the rifle that night until his fingers bled. Ruth cleaned the blade and bandaged the cuts without a word. The next day, they rode into town. Not for supplies, not for justice. For names. They didn't need to ask. The cowardice of men always sits nearest their mouths. A drunk at the saloon snorted when Ruth walked in, said something about the witch and her black ram. That was enough. Silas broke his jaw in 3 places. The sheriff watched from the porch, thumb hooked into his vest, and said nothing. They found the boy who carved the rock, too, 17, freckled, pale with fear. Ruth looked him in the eye. "You ever step foot near our land again," she said, "I'll make your mother bury you with her own hands." The boy cried, wet and loud. She didn't blink. After that, Sundown learned to keep its teeth in its mouth. But there were others who didn't forget, men from beyond the ridge, men with long memories and dirtier debts. One night a letter came nailed to the barn. It was old paper stained with oil. A name was scrawled across it, Jebediah Crane. Silas read it and went pale, sat down hard on the porch step like the air had been punched out of him. "He's not a man," Silas said. "He's a plague in boots." Ruth waited. "He was mine once we rode together. Stole cattle, burned fields, before the ranch before you. I left that life behind, but I never paid what I owed." "What does he want?" she asked. Silas looked at her, and his eyes were raw. "You?" She didn't flinch, just turned and walked into the house, pulled down the rifle, loaded it slow. "He won't have me," she said. The next days were a waiting game. They locked the livestock in the high pasture, dug ditches near the barn, laid out oil tins near the road. Ruth slept in her boots. Silas kept a pistol on the nightstand. Then the riders came. 5 of them, dust on their hats, guns shining. Crane at the front, lean as bone, face like dry leather stitched with hate. They didn't ride fast, they didn't shout. They just came close enough to let their shadows stretch over the house, then turned and left. A warning. The next morning, Ruth found a dead cow with its tongue cut out. That night she sat on the porch with the rifle across her knees. Silas beside her, both of them still as stones. He said, "You can run, take the mule, ride east, find a town that don't know your face." She said, "You think I married you to escape. I think you married me because it was the only door left open." Ruth looked at him long. "Then you should know, I don't walk through doors just to run back out." Crane returned on the 4th night. No warning. No words. A bullet shattered the kitchen window. Another struck the fence post where Ruth had been moments before. She fired back from the porch, dropped one of the horses. Chaos, smoke, the air full of shouting. Silas took a bullet to the shoulder but stayed upright, firing until the hammer clicked empty. Crane vanished into the dark. But not before Ruth put a shot clean through the side of his coat. When dawn came, she found blood on the gravel, not enough for death, but enough for a trail. Silas collapsed after that, fever, infection. She boiled rags, dressed the wound, whispered nothing, just worked, just waited, just watched the ridge for another rider. 3 days later, she packed food, the rifle, and Silas's knife. He was too weak to stop her. "You don't know what he is," he whispered. "I know what he's not," she said. "He's not the last man to think he owned me." Then she rode out, alone. North toward the canyon, toward the place where old debts still breathed. The canyon had no name on maps, just a gash of red earth beyond Carrion Ridge where vultures circled slow over shadow. Folks said men who rode into it came back changed, if they came back at all. Ruth rode into it without fear. She rode with the rifle slung behind her back, a hunting knife tied to her thigh, and a pouch of boiled beans in her coat. Her hair was tied back in a knot so tight it made her scalp ache. That ache steadied her, reminded her of her body, the blood it carried, the purpose it bore. She followed the trail Crane left like it was scripture. Bent branches, a boot heel sunk deep in clay, blood dried black on a stump. She moved careful, fast, never stopped long enough for sleep. 3 days out, the mule stumbled and threw a shoe. She walked the rest. Barefooted the last mile when the creek tore her boots to shreds. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. She only walked, jaw clenched, hands numb. Crane's camp sat low in a basin choked with mesquite. Smoke curled from a fire pit. Horses hobbled by the water, 4 men, maybe 5. One stood apart, facing the wind, tall, coated in animal skins. She watched them from a rise, crouched low, breath slow and steady. She waited until nightfall. Then crept in quiet, knife gripped tight. She wasn't after all of them, not yet. She was after Crane. She slit the first man's throat without a sound, buried his body in dry leaves. The second she shot in the gut as he stumbled from the latrine. He screamed. She shot him again. Then the camp erupted, gunfire, shouting, hooves tearing free. Crane didn't run. He stood by the fire like he'd been waiting. "You're not as pretty as they said," he called. Ruth stepped out of the dark, rifle leveled. They lied. He grinned, black teeth, cracked lips, a mouth born for cruelty. "You think this is vengeance," he said. "You don't know the first thing about it." "I know enough." He moved then fast for a man his age, drew and fired. The shot grazed her shoulder, tore fabric and flesh. She didn't fall, fired back, missed. Wind whipped the smoke, sparks rose. They circled each other like wolves, the fire between them hissing. "You're his woman," Crane spat. "His shield, that what you are now." "I'm not anyone's anything," she said. Then she lunged. The knife caught his wrist, he caught hers. They fell hard, tangled in dust. He struck her face once, twice. Blood filled her mouth. She bit down on his thumb and twisted until bone cracked. He howled. She jammed the knife under his ribs and pulled. He froze, gurgled, collapsed. She rolled off him and stared at the stars. It wasn't over, not yet. She stood, shoulders burning, blood soaking her shirt. Found the last rider hiding by the horses. Shot him through the knee, then the head. She burned the camp. Every tent, every map, every saddle. The flames lit the canyon walls gold and black. She stood barefoot in the glow, face empty. When the fire died, she gathered what she could, water, rope, Crane's revolver, then turned south. The ride back was a blur, fever nipped at her heels. She drank from stagnant puddles, slept beneath thorn trees, kept one eye open for snakes. Her shoulder swelled, the wound oozed, twice she fainted. Once she woke with a buzzard watching her from a branch. But she made it. By the time she crested the ridge and saw the Rourke house below, her legs gave out. She collapsed in the yard, dirt in her teeth, hands clenched. Silas found her that way, carried her inside, washed her with rainwater, sat beside her bed for 3 days while she shook and muttered and burned. She woke on the 4th. "You're home," he said. She stared at him, eyes glassy. "It's done." He nodded. "I know. I killed them. I know." She turned her face to the window. The orchard in bloom, bees droning, a soft wind rising. That night they shared the bed again. Not as strangers, not as saviors, just 2 bodies bearing the same kind of weight. In the morning she walked to the creek and scrubbed the blood from her clothes, hung them to dry on the line, sat on the porch with the rifle and watched the road. No one came. No letters. No curses. Just quiet. But it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was earned. It was owned. And it was hers. Summer came heavy that year, like a punishment. The sun blistered the hills raw and turned the dust into knives. Crops withered early. Flies swarmed the cattle's eyes. Ruth took to riding before dawn, checking the far fence lines before the heat took hold. Her shoulder ached when she stretched too far, a reminder of Crane's bullet. She did not complain. Scars were the price of peace. Silas walked with a limp now, old wounds stiffening. His strength came slower, but his eyes had steadied. He had buried his pistol beneath the cottonwood tree, said it was time for different tools. Ruth kept hers, not out of fear, out of memory. The townsfolk spoke of them with caution. At the post office they whispered. At the feed store they fell silent when Ruth entered. But they no longer dared to touch her, no longer dared to test the quiet that trailed behind her like a cloak. Word of Crane's death had traveled. No one claimed to mourn him. That September a girl from town came to the ranch. 14, mute, bruises down her arms like ink run through water. Ruth didn't ask who sent her, didn't ask who she was running from, just took her inside, made her a cot by the stove, and laid a cloth to her swollen cheek. The girl stayed, didn't speak for weeks, but followed Ruth everywhere, watched her gut a rabbit, watched her clean the rifle, watched her tend the beans, trim the horse's hooves, slice through the thick tendon of a dead calf without blinking. One evening, the girl picked up the knife. Ruth nodded, showed her how to hold it. They didn't need words. The orchard bloomed again come fall. Ruth walked among the trees barefoot, trailing her fingers across bark that remembered older hands. There was a new stone now beside the first, smaller, no name, just a carving gone to dirt, not forgotten. She didn't ask Silas who it was for. He didn't say. They had a language now that lived beneath silence. That winter Ruth dug a new well, with her own hands, pickaxe swinging until her palms split. The water came up clean and cold. She smiled just once. No one saw. One night she heard the girl crying, not loud, just a small sound in the dark. Ruth rose from bed, stepped into the kitchen, and found the girl at the table with a match in her hand, lighting and snuffing it again and again. She sat across from her, waited. After a long silence, the girl said, "They buried my mama with her eyes open." Ruth didn't flinch. "You want me to go dig her out?" The girl looked up, startled, then shook her head. "She ain't in the ground no more." They didn't speak again that night, but the next day the girl began to call the cattle by name. Spring thawed the land, and Ruth felt her bones ease for the first time in years. She still slept light, still kept her rifle cleaned and her boots by the door, but the fear had curled into something else. Not safety, never that, but something sharper, something earned. The town changed, too, quietly. A new preacher came, young, carried a scar down his neck and never preached damnation. Just read the book like it hurt him to do it. Folks listened. One day, a woman Ruth didn't recognize stopped her on the street. "You're the one who made the butcher's boy disappear," she said, eyes wide. Ruth tilted her head. "No." The woman blinked. "I made him afraid to come back," Ruth said, then walked on. Silas began to age in the way men do when peace sits too long in their chest, slower in the knees, eyes soft at the edges. He still rode the fence line, still mended gates, but he let Ruth do the talking now. She paid the ranch hands, she bartered for feed, she ran the brand. They never spoke of love, never needed to. Their bond was in the land, in the long silence between words. In the way he passed her coffee each morning, steam rising between their hands. Years passed, seasons rolled and bit and healed. The girl grew tall. Ruth taught her to shoot, then to lead. She rode the south pasture alone by 16. By 18, she branded her first calf. "You gonna name the ranch something?" she asked Ruth one dusk. Ruth thought for a long time. "No, it's not a name that keeps a place alive, it's what it remembers." She buried Silas beneath the orchard when the time came. No ceremony, no preacher, just her, the girl, and the sound of wind in the grass. She carved the stone herself. No words, just the mark of a ram etched deep. The house stood. The well stayed clean. No one came up the road without reason. And when they did, Ruth met them on the porch with the rifle in hand and the girl at her side. There were no more baitings. There were no more townsfolk with laughing mouths and stones in their fists. There was only the land, and the two women who had claimed it by fire, by blood, and by their own unyielding hands.